everybody. In continuation of our series of applied neuroanatomy, today we are going to discuss the anatomy of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does all the functions. People take it for granted. It is the center of all what we think. It has no center. We actually have two hypothalami, right and left, that become separated and evident in cases of tumors like craniopharyngiomas. So this is an MRI picture of patient with craniopharyngoma, and you see here separating the left and the right hypothalami. The hypothalamus is an organ weighing only 4 grams of 1200 grams of the total brain. These 4 grams have all the vital functions of the human body, all the essential functions of the human body, all the homeostasis of the human body, and any affection of this hypothalamus, whether total or partial, is either incompatible with life or leaves the patient with severe disability. So some of the functions of the hypothalamus are the high function, the coordination of the autonomic nervous system. It is the connection between the brain and the autonomic nervous system, which is, all you know, as you know, is an efferent system that controls all the autonomic functions of the human body. It is responsible for regulating the body temperature, water balance, controlling anterior pituitary secretion, and also storing some hormones in the posterior pituitary, controlling reproduction, growth, food intake, and emotional behavior. The gross anatomy of the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a triangle having 3 boundaries, and from its name, hypothalamus, it is present below the thalamus. Actually, it is below and anterior to the thalamus. The anterior boundary is the lamina terminalis. The inferior boundary is the interpeduncular fossa, as we'll see it now, and the superior boundary is the hypothalamic sulcus, which is evident on the medial surface of the hypothalamus, separating it from the thalamus. This is the position of the hypothalamus. This is the thalamus here. Anteroinferior is the hypothalamus, the nuclei, the chiasm, pituitary stalk, and pituitary gland. Another view showing the hypothalamus and showing the boundaries. The anterior boundary is the lamina terminalis, which is a neural structure extending from the rostrum of the corpus callosum to the upper part, the posterior part of the upper surface of the chiasm. We have a superior border, which is the hypothalamic sulcus, separating the hypothalamus from the thalamus, and we have the inferior border, interpeduncular fossa, which is containing the optic chiasm, the tubercinarium going to the pituitary stalk, and the mammillary body. This is an MRI picture, sagittal view, showing the position of the hypothalamus. And this is a diagrammatic view showing the position and the different nuclei of the hypothalamus. We'll see what are these nuclei, where they are, and what is the function of these nuclei, and how can we understand and we can study the hypothalamus in a very simple way. This is another view, anterior border, superior border, and inferior border of the hypothalamus. First, we discuss the blood supply. The blood supply of the hypothalamus is from perforators. Perforators are coming from the anterior cerebral artery, some from the carotid artery, the anterior perforated substance, many perforators from the posterior communicating artery, which is connecting the internal carotid with the posterior cerebral artery, and some of the perforators of the basilar artery and the posterior cerebral. So the blood supply, anterior cerebral, internal carotid, posterior communicating, basilar, and the proximal posterior cerebral, giving perforators supplying the interpeduncular fossa which is the inferior border or inferior boundary of the hypothalamus. We have to discuss always the blood supply of the pituitary gland with the hypothalamus, and this is a view of the cavernous sinus on the right side. This is taking out the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, showing the nerves. You will find here that there is one artery arising from the internal carotid artery immediately after it enters the intracranial cavity from the distal ring, and going medially, it is the only medial branch of the carotid, superior hypophyseal artery, and also posteriorly there is the meningohypophyseal trunk. One of the branches is the inferior hypophyseal artery, which supplies the pituitary gland. So superior hypophyseal artery from the carotid and the inferior hypophyseal artery from the meningohypophyseal trunk of the intracavernous carotid. This is the diagram, and here we can see the superior hypophyseal artery, the only medial branch of the carotid, and we have the meningohypophyseal trunk arising from the intracavernous carotid and giving the inferior hypophyseal artery, which is giving the blood supply to the posterior pituitary. One important factor in the pituitary, we're talking about the blood supply. You know that the hypothalamus has arterial supply and venous drainage. The venous drainage of the hypothalamus take you to another plexus of veins, like a portal circulation, plexus of veins connected to plexus of vein, and this is a very important issue because this portal circulation carries all the factors controlling the hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary gland and are the basis of all the feedback mechanism of the hormones of the human body. So you should know also always that there is a portal circulation between the hypothalamus and the pituitary stalk and the anterior pituitary gland. This is another view showing parts of the hormones that are secreted in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary, and the portal circulation taking the factors controlling the anterior pituitary hormones through this portal circulation. The nuclei of the hypothalamus, actually there are 11 nuclei in the hypothalamus. Don't worry, don't be scared. It's very easy to remember, and you will know it very easily, and you will know their function. And at the end of, I hope that at the end of this lecture, you will be very familiar with these nuclei. To divide the hypothalamus, the easiest way is to make it divided into 3 zones and 3 regions. The 3 zones, we call it zone if we are talking about from medial to lateral. Medial, that's adjacent to the third ventricle, intermediate and lateral. And the regions is from rostrocaudal or from anterior to posterior, as you will see. If we are discussing the medial part, and we'll find that there are some nuclei in the medial part, what we call the periventricular nucleus, adjacent to the third ventricle, medial and lateral hypothalamic nuclei. So the 3 zones from medial to lateral are the periventricular, subependymal, immediately lateral to the third ventricle, the most important nuclei of which are the paraventricular nucleus. Paraventricular, it is the nucleus adjacent but outside the ventricle, and the arcuate nuclei involved in endocrine autonomic regulation. The medial zone, which is actually the intermediate zone, we call it the medial zone, lateral to the periventricular zone, containing nuclei involved in endocrine and autonomic system, also mainly the GIT. And the lateral zone containing few nuclei and fibrous bundles, mainly the medial forebrain bundle, involved in the autonomic nervous system, mainly the cardiovascular system. So, the periventricular involved in autonomic and endocrine regulation, the medial zone with the GIT, and the lateral zone with the cardiovascular system. And this is a view showing the medial divisions going from medial to lateral, the paraventricular nuclei, and the different nuclei, medial zone, the paraventricular zone, the medial zone, and the lateral zone. Rostrocaudally, there is another division of the regions into regions, not zones. The chiasmal region, and this is the easiest way, and you will all understand it very easily. That is, if you look to the inferior surface of the hypothalamus, as we said, the inferior boundary, the interpeduncular area, you will find that anterior we have the chiasmal region from the lamina terminalis to the caudal part of the optic chiasm. We have the tuberal region and the mammillary region, as you will see it now. So this is above the chiasm is the chiasmal region, going in the middle, giving the tuber cinereum and the pituitary stalk, is the intermediate region, and the mammillary region or the posterior region. Again, you will find these nuclei distributed in the three regions: chiasmal, the tuberal region, and the mammillary region. And this is the arrangement of the different nuclei of the thalamus, of the hypothalamus, and we will discuss the function of each of this group of nuclei very easily. As we said, they are 11 nuclei. We can see it here. These are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The brown is the mammillary region, the blue is the tuberal region, and the green is the supraoptic region or the preoptic region. The supraoptic is green and the preoptic region is blue or violet. This is the different nuclei, different names, sometimes difficult to remember, but you will remember them very easily after that when you know what are the functions and what are they present for. The supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, these are two very famous nuclei. All neurosurgeons know about it because they are secreting the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin, and together with the supraoptic and the paraventricular, together with the arcuate nucleus. These nuclei have something very peculiar. They have a large cells, as you will see now. This is the paraventricular nucleus, and this is the supraoptic and the paraventricular nucleus. Here we see the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. So these are involved in secreting the hormone, two hormones that are secreted and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, the vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. These are two very important nuclei having common function with the arcuate nucleus. So from here we know the function of three nuclei: the paraventricular, the supraoptic, and the arcuate nuclei. So there is another nucleus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, from its name, is present above the chiasm. As we will see, it is responsible for the circadian rhythm of the hormones. It gets information from the optic chiasm about the light, if it is daylight or night, and accordingly it gives information to other nuclei to secrete or to reduce the secretion of different hormones. So it is like a clock, the timer for the hormone secretion that gets information from the chiasm, suprachiasmatic, and then accordingly the nuclei will have the circadian rhythm. As example, you have the growth hormone level increases at night, and the cortisol level increases in the morning and is reduced at night. So when he gets the information from the chiasm. It is day. It goes to the cells of secreting the corticotropic hormone, influencing the production of ACTH and the cortisone, increasing it, and the reverse at night. So this is the function of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. There is also a very important nucleus behind the lamina terminalis, very well known to neurosurgeons who are working in tumors like craniopharyngiomas, and it is anterior, so it is the preoptic together with the anterior nucleus, anterior hypothalamic nucleus. These two nuclei are located anteriorly behind the lamina terminalis, and they are responsible for heat dissipation. You will see it later. How can the body dissipate the heat? So if you injure these nuclei, and it is not uncommon in such dangerous surgeries, you can find the patient with post-operative fever of 41 degrees centigrade because he is unable to dissipate the heat because of injury of these two important nuclei. On the other hand, this is the preoptic and anterior hypothalamic nucleus. The posterior hypothalamic nucleus is involved in heat conservation. It is very, very rarely injured because it is very posterior located, and it is doing measures to conserve. It is responsible for conservation of the body heat. We are left with two nuclei here, the dorsomedial nucleus and the ventromedial nucleus, which are present in the medial zone, as you remember. The dorsomedial nucleus is involved in behavior, and the ventromedial nucleus is involved in the appetite and the control of hunger and satiety center and the hunger center. So the mammillary body, as you will see, is involved in memory and emotion. So these are the 11 nuclei of the hypothalamus. Another revision: those secreting oxytocin antidiuretic hormone are the supraoptic, paraventricular nuclei, and the arcuate nucleus. Those involved in heat dissipation are the anterior hypothalamic nucleus and the preoptic nucleus. Heat conservation, posterior hypothalamic nucleus. Emotional behavior, dorsal medial nucleus of the thalamus, the ventromedial nucleus of the thalamus in the appetite, and the mammillary nuclei are involved in emotions and memory. So, as we said, again, the supraoptic, paraventricular, arcuate nuclei, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, as we said, is involved in circadian timing. The anterior nucleus and the preoptic nucleus are involved in the autonomic control and heat dissipation. To dissipate heat or to conserve heat, you have to have an autonomic control. The posterior nucleus is involved in controlling the autonomic nervous system and heat conservation. Again, this is the hypothalamus, and this is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, clock, circadian rhythm. Lamina terminalis here, preoptic anterior, heat dissipation. Posterior, heat conservation. Dorsomedial, emotional behavior. Ventromedial, the appetite and satiety centers. And the arcuate is also with the preoptic and anterior nucleus. The dorsomedial nucleus, as we said, in controlling behavior. Also, some of the people working in craniopharyngiomas will notice that the behavior of the patient differed. To get it from the family, he might become more aggressive, more blunted in behavior, because if there is damage to the dorsomedial nucleus. The ventromedial nucleus, controlling the appetite, the body weight, and insulin secretion, and also we all know in craniopharyngiomas, whether without surgery or after surgery, I can get hyperphagia and they become very strong eaters and they gain so much weight if there is damage to the ventromedial nucleus. And again, these are the functions of the different nuclei of the hypothalamus. The mammillary nuclei are involved, as we said, emotions, expression, and memory. Why? Because they are receiving the fornix from the hippocampus, from the parahippocampal gyrus, which is responsible for the memory, and that's why the mammillary bodies are responsible for the memory. Also, they receive from the amygdala, which is also responsible for the memory. That's why it is involved in emotions and in memory. And why in emotions? Also because it is involved in the pathway of Papez or the circuit of Papez. Mammillary body is involved, circuit of Papez for emotions, and taking the fornix from the hippocampus involved in memory. The lateral tuberal region is, as we said, control of appetite, the ventromedial nucleus. Pathways of the hypothalamus. The role of the hypothalamus is homeostasis through controlling the autonomic nervous system, the neuroendocrine system, and the limbic system. Don't be scared from this view. The afferents from the hypothalamus, what are the receiving, actually they are double way, getting fibers from and going to. So what is the hypothalamus receiving? It is receiving from the orbitofrontal cortex, the medial forebrain bundle. It is receiving from the mammillary bodies, the tegmentomammillary, and from the thalamus, the thalamomammillary, and that's enough. So, and it's receiving from the fornix, mammillary region, receiving from the amygdala. So you don't have to retain by heart. You know that the amygdala sends to the hypothalamus, so one afferent. You know that the fornix ends in the mammillary, which is a part of the hypothalamus, two afferents. You know that the medial forebrain bundle connects the cortex by fibers going and coming from the orbitofrontal cortex. This is the third afferent. And you know also there is something called mammillothalamic and mammillotegmental tracts. Mammillothalamic between the mammillary body and the thalamus, which is part of circle of Papez, and mammillotegmental between the mammillary body and the tegmentum of the midbrain. Also there is tegmentomammillary and thalamomammillary. So tegmentomammillary, thalamomammillary, medial forebrain bundle, the fornix, and from the amygdala. These are the hypothalamic afferents. And we see here that the hypothalamus receives afferents from the limbic system, as we said, the amygdala and the hippocampus. It receives from the neocortex through the medial forebrain bundle. It receives from the thalamus, thalamomammillary. It receives from the tegmentum also, and also has visual input, and it receives from the viscera, brainstem, and spinal cord. All these are hypothalamic afferents. The hypothalamic pathways are extensively bilateral, as I told you, so the efferents will be the same. The medial forebrain bundle sending efferents to the orbitofrontal cortex. Also, these are the mammillothalamic tract, part of the circle of Papez, the mammillotegmental tract going to the dorsal tegmental nucleus of and the reticular formation of the midbrain, and some sending fibers to the spinal cord, as we will see here. So the hypothalamus, the efferents, sending efferents to the mammillary body, mammillothalamic efferents go to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, mammillotegmental to the midbrain reticular formation. There is the efferents, hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, the factors controlling the secreting hormones and storing them in the posterior pituitary is an efferent also. And also there is efferent from the hypothalamus to the brainstem and spinal cord so that he can control the autonomic nervous system. How can the hypothalamus control the autonomic nervous system without having efferents going to the brainstem and the spinal cord and the medial forebrain bundle to the prefrontal cortex? So these are the hypothalamic efferents. You should not remember all of them, but if you understand the details and you very well understanding the details, you can remember most of them. This is the functions the hypothalamus is doing in relation to the pituitary gland. So these are the large cells, the magna cells present in the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei and the arcuate nucleus, releasing oxytocin and the vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. They are stored in the posterior pituitary, and then the oxytocin function is working on the myoepithelial cells, basket cells, that are compressing the acini, producing milk, and they are stimulated by sucking, and also it helps in uterine contractions during delivery or during orgasm. And the antidiuretic hormone is working on the distal convoluted tubules responsible for the facultative water reabsorption. These are the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary hormones are the prolactin, which is responsible for milk reproduction, growth hormone for growth of the soft tissues and bone, and the follicular stimulating hormone, utilizing hormone for the reproduction and producing estrogen, progesterone in the females and the testosterone in the females. So in the male, as we will see, it is important for the spermatogenesis and for the nutrition of the sperms. In the males, in the females, it is responsible for the production, controlling the ovaries, producing estrogen and producing progesterone from the corpus luteum. Also produces ACTH, controlling the adrenal, and thyroid stimulating hormone, controlling the thyroid. All these hormones are under control of the hormones or the factors secreted from the hypothalamus, and the feedback goes back to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus. Examples of autonomic pathways. We are not supposed to study this or to say it, but you have to have an idea that there is always a feedback from the visceral organs to the hypothalamus, because, as we said, it is the autonomic control, and because it is responsible for the hunger and for the satiety centers. And from here, you see some hormones going back from the stomach to the hypothalamus, which is the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. Some material like ghrelin from the stomach, PYY 336, is from the intestine, from the pancreas, and from the fat adipose tissues, the leptin going to the hypothalamus. It's a very complex process, but you should not remember this, but you should know that there is a feedback always between the viscera, the adipose tissue, and the hypothalamus. Also, again, and we have the information given from the stomach, from the pancreas, from the intestine, going back, vagal afferents, brainstem, and reaching at the end the hypothalamus to act. So, for instance, the adipose tissue produces a matter called leptin substance, which is reaching the hypothalamus. The pancreas, the insulin, we have glucoreceptors on the hypothalamus, and the intestine, as we said, the PYY and other materials. And you should not go through details, but you should know that the hunger and the satiety centers present in the ventromedial nucleus of the thalamus or the hypothalamus, as we said, and they have feedbacks from different parts of the body. Very complex, forget about it. Controlling the hormonal control of the pituitary, as we said, the magna cellular nuclei, the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei, secreting the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone posterior pituitary, and the portal circulation, taking the factors, different factors, to the anterior pituitary. This is to remind you that the mammillary body is responsible for memory and for emotions. This is another view showing the pituitary gland and where are present the pituitary hormones. Another we discussed before. This is very important to know that there is a feedback between the effector organ, they are working on it, and between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. For example, the hypothalamus produces the gonadotropic hormone controlling the anterior pituitary gland. Anterior pituitary gland produces follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone in males. FSH is facilitating spermatogenesis. The maturation of sperms goes through the FSH and the LH in males. Interstitial cells of Leydig, which are nutritive to the sperms. And there is secretion of testosterone and the inhibin, Leydig cells producing testosterone. There is a negative feedback. If the amount of testosterone increases, the feedback goes to the anterior pituitary and goes to the hypothalamus. For the female, also, we have the hypothalamus secreting gonadotroph releasing hormones, or lutotropin releasing hormones to the pituitary gland. From the pituitary gland, they produce a luteinizing hormone FSH, working on the ovaries, producing progesterone and estrogen, which have a feedback on, reverse feedback on the hypothalamus. Also, the growth hormone has this feedback. You should know that there is a feedback from the effector organs to the hypothalamus to regulate the amount of hormone secretion. Did we end all the hypothalamic functions? No, actually we forgot about, should talk about the heat regulation. How can we regulate heat through the hypothalamus? From the skin temperature, from the temperature of the peripheral thermoreceptors on the skin and visceral receptors, they reach the deep brain temperature, and there is thermoreceptors on the surface of the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus reacts through the autonomic nervous system. So, through the skin arterioles, the skeletal muscles, and sweat glands. So, if there is excessive heat, the arterioles of the skin dilate, and the sweat glands will work, and the skeletal muscles are relaxed to reserve the body temperature. If the heat is very low heat, the hypothalamus reacts by producing autonomic affection, constriction of the skin arterioles, by preventing sweat glands from working, and by shivering to get rising. How can you rise the body temperature? How can you? And these are, again, the preoptic area, what we said, the preoptic and anterior nuclei for heat dissipation, and the posterior hypothalamic nucleus for heat conservation. Did we end all hypothalamic functions? Actually, no. Hypothalamus has got receptors on its surface, the glucoreceptors, to regulate insulin production. The thermoreceptors, as we said, there is a feedback between the pancreas and the hypothalamus. Thermoreceptors to regulate body temperature, and osmoreceptors to regulate fluid and electrolyte balance, namely the sodium. And how can you regulate the osmoreceptors? Through the production of the antidiuretic hormone. How can they regulate the body temperature? Through the cutaneous vasodilatation, through the shivering, and through the sweat glands. how they control glucoreceptors by influencing the production of insulin. When I was young, I used always to ask my question, how can we have information about the blood glucose level in the blood? And we have a blood-brain barrier. And we all know that the glucose level in the cerebrospinal fluid is far less than that in the blood. Let's say it is 40 to 80 milligrams per milliliter, while the blood 80 to 120. So how we can get information of the blood glucose level? And this was the answer. There are areas of the brain which are having no blood-brain barrier, reaching the blood directly, and the hypothalamus has one of these areas which is called the organum vasculosum. Organum vasculosum has no blood-brain barrier, and the glucoreceptors are present on the surface of the hypothalamus in this region, and they can get information directly from the blood about the glucose level and react accordingly for the production of insulin. Did we end all hypothalamic functions? Hypothalamus is always involved in wakefulness. Also, those who are working with dangerous hypothalamic tumors and like craniopharyngiomas, they know that if there is an injury to the hypothalamus, the patient is sleepy. So when you give him a painful stimulus, he wakes up, he says few words, and then he sleeps again. Wakefulness is an active process, one of the theories, continuously sending impulses from different subcortical regions to the cerebral cortex. So continuous impulses from the subcortical centers to the cerebral cortex. One of the most important centers are the posterior hypothalamus, sending always impulses to the cerebral cortex, and also the reticular formation of the brain stem, sending impulses to the cerebral cortex to keep the patient awake. So this is another function. Proposed pathways for wakefulness, you don't go through details, but you know that there are impulses going from the hypothalamus to the cerebral cortex to keep patients awake, and this is a part of the mechanism. It is not the only subcortical organ, but part of the subcortical organs, and it is a very well-known fact that injury to the hypothalamus produces excessive sleep. Did we end all hypothalamic functions? Yes, for the sake of teaching and for the sake of what we know. But definitely, I believe that there are very complex functions for the hypothalamus that are not discovered yet. And all this and more in a 2 centimeter structure weighing 4 grams. Thank you.